Hey everyone, welcome to the Anderson Bros Outdoors. I'm Jake, and today we're going to talk about winches, so stay tuned. I was at a comp last weekend, and this comp I actually set up, and I feel terrible because typically I hate to winch unless it's a bonus gate or something, but for this competition, the rain came and impacted the area we were going to cross. We moved to another area that was right in the same vicinity. We didn't have time to prep, and well, that resulted in a lot of winching, unfortunately. I figured I would do an overall video on winching to go over some things that I think are important, at least to me. So first things first, what is a winch? A winch is a device that's attached to your vehicle or side-by-side or four-wheeler or whatever. Typically it's a device attached to a vehicular of some sort, and it has a rope and a hook on the end, and you use it to unstick yourself, meaning that if you're stuck in the mud or sand or anywhere, you can take that rope, attach it to something else, a winch point typically, and it will pull your vehicle out or assist pulling your vehicle out when you're really stuck. So this is really popular in other channels on YouTube, such as Matt's Off-Road Recovery, where they take winches and other elastic ropes and they go and recover people. So the first thing I want to talk about when it comes to winches for RC cars, trucks, whatever, is the winch type. There are 3 different types or more. It's really not a winch, it's a servo. So the thing that steers your car or truck or whatever, there's no limits in the servo. It just continuously spins one way or the other, and that is a winch. Now you have different winch types or servo types. This is an example right here, this Reef's low profile 299. It's essentially a steering servo without the limits, and it is half-sized. Now you can get full-size servos that are bigger, so this is supposed to be 299 ounces of pulling power. You can get a 400-ounce pulling power, which is the regular size servo. There are different types of winches. This is the most common type. You have a full-size or half-size servo that would be a winch. Your spool sits on top and it spins. Now you have other winch types as well, such as scale winches, so you can replicate like a Warn winch. Warn is the name brand of a winch. And you have micro winches. So a micro winch would be a micro servo, something like this NSD RC 100. This is obviously going to only have 100 ounces of pulling power, where something like this is going to have 200 ounces of pulling power, but there's a pretty significant difference in terms of weight. So typically, if you run a scale truck or a heavy comp truck, you're going to want to run something like this full size that has enough power to pull your truck. If you're running a class 2 or class 3 comp truck that weighs 6 to 8 pounds or less, then this micro winch will do just fine typically. So there's 3 different kinds of winches at least. There's full-sized and half-sized winches like this that are regular shaped, meaning they have the regular servo dimensions. Scale winches that would fit on bumpers and things of that nature, Warn for example. And then there's the micro winches like this. Again, it's really going to depend on what you're going to want to do with it and how much weight you're going to want to pull, which winch to get. Typically, when it comes to servos, the more money you spend, the better, but that's not always the case. We've gone over the type of winch, or really the servo type, if you will. Let's move into how that servo gets power. Now, there's 2 ways that a servo gets power. The first way is through your ESC. Your ESC provides power to your receiver through the form of a beck, and then the receiver then gives power to your steering servo and or your winch. Now there's another form of power supply, and that's called direct power, meaning that there are 2 separate wires coming out of your servo. One has a plug for your receiver, and typically it only has 2 wires in it, so you're missing the middle wire. And then you have another plug coming out of it that plugs directly into where your battery goes. Or most commonly, they're JST connectors, little red connectors. And you simply just solder the JST connector onto where your battery plug is for your ESC, and that's how you provide power. Rule of thumb for what power source you should get is typically if you're running a truck 6 to 8 pounds or less, then it doesn't matter. You can run beck power or direct power. Now, if you're running a truck that's 8 pounds or more, I would highly suggest you get a direct power winch, or you set up a dedicated beck for that winch. So that way, when you do go to draw power for it, you're not killing the receiver as well. What a lot of people don't understand is that the receiver itself has a limited amount of amperage that you can draw through it, and you would be more beneficial to get the power directly from the battery or a beck to provide that power. Now, there are some things to keep in mind when getting a direct power servo. Most servos are only 2 or 3S capable, meaning that if you're running 4 or 6S in your crawler, comp crawler, or whatever, you're gonna have to get a dedicated power supply for it, or a dedicated battery, because that servo is likely only going to be 2 or 3S. Now, there are servos made by Reefs and NSDRC and Shift that are 4S capable. You wanna keep in mind when you're doing your build, your batteries and everything else in consideration when making a decision on not just a winch, but really everything. The third thing I want to go over is line type. This may sound like a funny thing to discuss, but you really want to know what line to use on your winch. Your winch will typically come with 2 to 3 feet of line that you can put on your spool, but that winch line is very thick, and 2 to 3 feet is not very much. You're going to end up with 6 to 8 inches less than you want due to tying the knots on the spool and the hook. Typically, what you'll see people utilize is something like this Suffolk 65-pound fishing braid. Now, this is what I use personally, and it works just fine. It will absolutely hold up to at least 50 pounds as I've tested it, and it's very thin. So I can put 10 to 12 feet of this line on a micro winch spool. The micro winch spool is actually smaller than the regular spool. Keep that in mind when purchasing line for your winch. There is a lot of other products out there that you can purchase, but you'll want to know the diameter of the line, because not all line will actually go through your spool itself. So if your spool only has a hole that's 0.5 millimeter and you buy some winch line that's 1 millimeter in diameter, you're not going to be able to put it on that spool. Or you'll have to tie a leader on the spool and then tie your really thick winch line to that leader. The fourth thing I want to talk about is hook type. Now, typically you can see with this truck here, we have a hook that comes with the winch. Now, this is a relatively small hook in the grand scheme of things. When you're doing non-competitions, it's absolutely fine. You'll run the winch all the way back up to the fair lead, much like you would in real life or a one-to-one vehicle, and you'll continue driving after you use it. Now, the other scenario is competitions. I would absolutely not recommend this winch hook for competitions, and the reason is that typically you have something like this elastic band on the other side of your truck where you are pulling your winch line out and you're hooking it up to this elastic band. The issue with that, as you can see, I'm already having problems doing it. Now, you put a controller in one hand and try and hook this to your elastic strap with the other hand, and you're going to have problems. I wasted probably 30 seconds to a minute trying to just get this winch line hooked back up to my elastic band over the course of 3 or 4 different winches. And 30 seconds to a minute is a lot of time to waste in a comp, especially when comps are only 6 to 8 minutes typically. The hook type is very important for competitions, not necessarily as important for scale crawls or scale vehicles where you're not actually going to be in a time limited run. But if you are, you're going to want to get a different winch hook. And there are many options out there on the market, but you'll want something that has a bigger hook and is easier to handle and or manipulate, so you can get it on your elastic band or wherever you want it. There you have it. Hook type is very critical. It's very important. I would highly suggest you look at all of the different ones on the market and determine one that's going to work best for you. The next thing I want to talk about is line length. Now, this may seem like a funny thing to talk about, but it's absolutely worth discussing as a bullet point. The reason that I say that is typically, as I stated, your winch is going to come with 2 to 3 feet of line. By the time it's all said and done, you're really only going to have 1.5 to 2.5 foot of line due to having to tie it to the spool and then also tie it to your hook. I'm running Suffolk 65-pound braid, and that's because it is really thin. The diameter of this line is extremely thin and it's extremely strong. You can get one of these, I don't know how much they are now, I bought this years ago for probably 15 to 20 bucks for this entire 300 yards, and this will last years just spooling these winches. I put 10 to 12 feet of line on my spools, so if you have an obstacle that's 8 to 10 feet long and you're trying to winch up it, you don't want to waste 2 or 3 winches. You don't want to spend 6 to 9 points on something that you can only spend 3 points on if you have enough line. So keep that in mind. The line length is absolutely a factor, and you want almost as much as you can get on there. You want at least an 1/8 inch of spool left on the spool to ensure that when you're despooling and respooling your line while it's in the truck, it's not going to fall off the spool and get pinched between the spool and the winch, or whatever the case is, it actually functions. The last thing you want to do is get to a comp, go to use your winch, and not have it in DNF. Which brings me into the next topic, which is preventative maintenance. So preventative maintenance for these winches is relatively easy. The servo itself, typical servo, make sure after every run or before every comp, you're checking your screws to make sure they're tight, make sure the spool screw is tight, make sure that the winch line going to your receiver, beck, whatever, it doesn't have any issues, tears, breaks, whatever in it. You're also going to want to despool your entire winch line and check it, much like you would fishing line, because as you're using your winch, you're hitting things like rocks or trees or whatever is out there on the course. And that stuff will deteriorate your line. It'll cause nicks or frays or whatever in it. And that will lead to a very bad day if you're stuck or jammed in a situation and you go to pull your truck out. If that does happen and your winch line breaks, you DNF. That's not a good time. So before every comp, you should make it a good practice to check your servo, check your wires, check your screws, and also despool your winch line and or just replace the winch line. It's relatively cheap. Really easy way of ensuring that you're not going to DNF because when you go to use your winch, it breaks. So the last thing I want to talk about is winch type itself. So we did talk about the servo type and the micro, regular, and scale winches. Now, when you get to these regular sized winches, there is a distinction between the two. You have a spool that sits off of the winch like this one. The spool would sit up here and you simply just wrap your winch line around it. And then you have another winch that is an internal spool, meaning that it looks the same as this, but it has a box or a cage around it. And inside of the cage is your spool. So it keeps your line in there without needing a guide. Typically you have a guide for a external winch or a winch like this. You'll have a guide to feed it with some sort of link end, rod end, whatever you want to call it, to ensure that your line is going back on the spool. On this truck specifically, we have the spool with the full-size winch, and you can see that we do have a guide in the front. The mount is 3D printed, and you simply just spool the line through the hole, and now it is a guide. So if you're like this, like this, like this, whenever you turn the winch on, it will go through that hole and it will go directly onto that spool. Internal winches don't necessarily need that guide there because they have a box or a rectangular shape to ensure that winch line goes directly onto the spool. You want to take that into account. A lot of people prefer internal winches or enclosed winches and not external ones because of that very reason. It prevents a lot of headaches potentially down the line. But you do have to keep in mind that when you are building a comp truck, you are looking at maximizing weight savings. Using a big boxy winch is going to be heavy. That's why I typically run micro winches in my comp truck. This is obviously an abnormality. I would typically run a micro winch right here bolted onto the trans. You can find those in the description below. It has a built-in lead or guide on it as well. So that kind of wraps up what I wanted to talk about. A few outliers. Typically, when you're running winch cable through your truck, in the back of your truck somewhere to kind of balance weight or offset weight, you would typically use something like antenna tube to run to the front of your truck to ensure that you're not going to have any issues with the winch line. One of the other best practices when running winch line is not to have extreme angles in your truck when going from here to here. You kind of want to have a pretty straight run to it. You don't want to zig and zag all over the place. You can do that, but you're going to lose effectiveness of your winch based off of that. So you want the straightest path possible. One of the other things to keep in mind is if your controller actually supports a winch. Running an NSDRC winch, they are extremely fast, and if it's on or off, I mean, you're flying. You're either going really fast in or really fast out, and that's problematic, especially if you're trying to do a slow, controlled pull, or if you're trying to get the hook right up to the fair lead and stop, or whatever the case is, and it can be an issue. You'll want to make sure that your radio is up to the task of controlling a winch, and you'll want to test it. You'll want to put the winch on, and you'll want to go out, and you'll want to do some simulated winches with it, because if you don't, you just throw it on there and go to the comp, you're going to set yourself up for failure. Last but certainly not least, before we wrap this video up, before you purchase a winch, make sure that you can purchase replacement parts for it. For NSDRC, you can purchase replacement gears and other parts for your winch on their website for relatively cheap. This is a $60 winch, and I accidentally broke the screw off in the servo horn gear set. And all I had to do was go onto the NSDRC website and buy a new gear set for like 10 or 15 bucks, and it replaces that. So I don't have to replace the whole $60 winch. I can replace the top hat portion here with ease. Not to mention, I have extra gears for if I strip the gears out in this winch for whatever reason. The chances of you stripping gears are pretty low. I've had a lot of these micro winches and I've not actually ever stripped any gears. I've only broken screws off in them. Wrapping all of this up, all of these things that you should take into consideration when going to install a winch on your vehicle, because they're things that I didn't think about. The last comp, we had two guys break their winch cable. I don't know if it's because of the sharp rock that was there or if they had already had damage to their winch line. But it is what it is. With that being said, huge shout out to all of the community. We really appreciate all the support you provide us. Even bigger shout out to all the TABO Club members. We couldn't do this without all of your support. Feel free to drop a like on the video, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next video, and we hope you have a great day.